This is great. I'm really excited to be here today. In addition to all the other reasons why this is a particular pet topic for me, as well as being a developer, I'm also a sex educator. So I spend a lot of time thinking about the intersection between my two particular unique worlds, and they actually do intersect. And this topic is one of those. Imagine walking through the world knowing that everyone's first assumptions about how you see yourself, who you love, what feels right for you are all completely wrong. Now imagine signing up for a cool website and then being required to select an option from the drop-down menu that does not include anything that represents you at all. You'll feel defeated. You'll want to argue that whatever they think they're learning from that drop-down menu, it's not really true of you. You'll want to tell them that they're adding to your humiliation by making you do this. You'll want to tell them that they're missing a huge part of you. Users have been giving pushback for a while like this. When they feel that they're being left out, they act. Social apps in particular are being pressed to adjust. Facebook, Google, others, they've been dealing with this for years. In 2008, Facebook was saying this was old news for them that they've been struggling with. So if you feel like you don't know how to deal with this stuff and you're trying to work it out and you feel out of your depth, you're not alone. When developers talk about normalization, we're usually talking about databases, right? But when dealing with human attributes, there's another construct, and we wind up conflating the two and pursuing a different cause, sociological normalization. So we're looking for that idealized norm to put in a form, right? And conflating the database normalization and socialized normalization works just fine as long as you're okay with your user base only coming from that idealized select little norm. And the rest of us, if you don't need money from the rest of us, it's cool. But most of us are going for that broad user base. And so we lose track a lot of times of one of the core objectives of database normalization itself, which is that we're supposed to be mirroring real-world concepts and their interrelationships. And the real world's really messy, which means our databases have to be allowed to be messy too. So why is that hard? Well, at first glance, there's stuff that makes this look really easy, right? It's forms. We've all done forms a million times. We've made forms. We've filled out forms. This doesn't seem complicated at all. But we get tripped up by some flawed premises. First is the premise that deeply personal stuff about humans can be reduced to lists. Secondly, there's an assumption that canonical lists for these things can exist, or that, in all traditional engineering fashion, we can create them. And the third problem is our faith that those first two problems can be easily solved by just adding more list items. So we know that's not going to work. And the reality is, at the end of the day, it risks making us look like dumbasses. So here's the next flawed premise, that we think we intuitively understand the nature of social networks. So let's step aside a minute from how social networking has been implemented as technology and just ask, what is a social network? What is it in purely human terms? That's the real life that our apps are meant to replicate and build upon. It's one-on-one. It's personal, as our social lives possibly can get. In social apps, identity is a dependency. And when we're talking about social networking, we're always talking about one-on-one. As much as we see this grand scale that seems like we're talking to a billion people, we're always doing one-on-one. As developers, we can break or build community that we're building with each line of our code. And we should be asking ourselves, what are the one-on-one relationships that we're fostering through our code? What are we hindering? And are we part of that relationship too? What is our one-on-one with the current user, and who's missing, who could be a current user if we were fostering that one-on-one with them? So in real life, the guy who says, I know your personhood better than you do, just sounds like a presumptuous jerk. In real life, that woman who says, who you are is completely invalid, just sounds so arrogant. In real life, your existence isn't possible, just is clueless. Who says this to you? It's not what we set out to do. We're not seeking to build communities that exclude or make us look foolish or make others feel insulted. We're setting out to create things that feel cutting edge and exciting and engaging. The last thing we think we're doing is conveying a message that we're out of touch with modern reality. But the subtext keeps coming up. Postel's law tells us be conservative in what you do and be liberal in what you accept from others. And so what I want to tell you about today is how we can do both. How are we going to bring those modern realities into data, views, logic? We start at schema level. As developers, we get tugged in two directions. Keep that code base manageable, and yet design for modern complexity. And that's really, really hard. So we have to get our schemas into alignment. And just as there's different meanings of normalization, there's different meanings of schema. So first there's that mental or psychological concept of schema. It's a set of our own preconceived ideas, our mental framework for representing some aspect of the world. It's a system that we use internally for organizing and perceiving new information. It's our filtering system. And then there's the database schemas, which are essentially the same thing imprinted onto a database. So your very personal schema is being sent out into the world, reflected through your app. When you use Rails scaffolding, you're creating a migration, right? And you've probably created one pretty much like this, more complex, hopefully. And that ultimately gets translated into a unified schema to be used by the environment's database. And then these are just the front-end manifestations of that mental schema. And they vary, don't they? Everyone's is different, which just goes to show that our idea that there is one way to describe human attributes or human behavior is always going to be wrong. As much as other humans are varied, so are we as developers. So schemas are this foundation for expressing something deeply intimate, for expressing our self-image, our identity, our important relationships, our values, even our spirit and creativity and uniqueness, which are not things we usually think about. They're defining user experience. Our code is user experience. Our schemas and our UX are leaving people behind. But we can fix that. When developing a schema that's going to ask a person about their experiences, their feelings, their sense of self, there's not going to be a right way. But what I can tell you is this. What we can do is evaluate the trade-offs and ask what benefit will the user notice. And notice I didn't say how will the user benefit, because that lets us off the hook. It gives us a lot of latitude to decide that whatever great thing I want to give you, you're going to benefit from and love, and thus your need is fulfilled. We need to think in terms of the user's mindset. What is it that they will pay attention to? What will feel relevant for their life, whether or not it's really cool? So evaluating from that user perspective gives us focus. And you can look at this chart, and there isn't any point where everyone is going to see maximum benefit, whether you're thinking of all the users or developers versus user base. So we have to start making strategic choices. Checkboxes, radio buttons, select menus, they are all implying that all possible values can be represented. We're saying to the user, pick one, pick the right one. Or in the select box case, maybe pick the right ones. But we're still suggesting that everything there covers all the possible bases. It's the real world being rejected because it didn't happen to look like our mental schema. Checking a box is a one-step option, and that's really convenient for the user. It feels really simple for us to convey. Entering a text string takes more work, and then we get results that are more messy. So both users and developers kind of agree, which one seems more preferable. A free-form solution like a text area or a text input doesn't seem exciting at first, but a free-form field does deliver some real benefits for users. At Metafilter, gender has been a text field for over a decade now. And this is a little interesting because initially the user base was very tilted towards developers, and There were quite a few who really were horrified that Matt was going to do this. That was for about 5 seconds. Then they jumped on board. Because what they learned is that they could be creative and silly. Take a minute. Go ahead. And because they could express this thing about themselves fully and with authentic voice, they really went for it. That text field, that one text field for gender, has grown into a beloved institution. And what you as a user put into it now says something revealing about who you are. That you're allowed to put anything into it or put in nothing at all says something revealing about what metafilter is meant to be for. That Schema's trust of the user was the foundation for the users to start asking for us to tell you more. Give us more places to reveal ourselves. All those were by request, and today Metafilter's users are trusted with a whole lot of free forms, including ones that most developers would, I think, instinctually really constrain and try to validate away. This is not a valid location, right? Go for it. The field values are blatantly contradictory, they're wrong, they're ridiculous. We're not going to give any objection to that. The message here is, user, it's okay, we got your back, we get it. This is your home. We're going to make it as comfortable and personal for you, and you should make it as comfortable and messy for yourself, because we can handle it as developers. When you're collecting data on people, you're in a very different realm. Now you're moving from computer science to social sciences. And if you want to run useful analytics about personal attributes and behavior, then data collection is going to have to meet some very different criteria. The two minimum criteria you need to meet for gathering human subjects data is every option needs to be exhaustive. That means that there can be nothing left in the universe for that field that could possibly be true. And the other is that the field's options must be mutually exclusive. No overlap at all, right? So if we say the options are, say, married and divorced, is there any possibility of overlap there at all? Some people get divorced and then they're married again. Do we really have we met the criteria? How many places in your apps don't? We see this one all the time, right? This seems like a pretty standard, clear, exhaustive set of values. And then you find out there's a few more. And then more, and we're still not anywhere near complete. We're never going to get there by adding more list items, and that's fine, because instead we can choose to look at human data from a really different perspective. Data doesn't have to be for analysis, folks. It's really easy to get into that habit of structuring data for the purpose of analysis and lose track and think that that is the reason it exists. But we can step back and wallow in that user perspective. That data is for sheer expressiveness on their part, that it has character, individualism, distinctiveness. It's who they are, it's not their data. Diaspora is an open source social networking project. A couple years ago, one of the developers there, Sarah May, turned gender into a text field there too. That was one of the commits. And just like on Metafilter, the users had such a blast with this stuff. But again, developers were not so amused. Unlike Metafilter, which is a closed service run by just a few people and all in English, Diaspora is meant to be internationalized and is a traditional open source project with a ton of people all with their own personal opinions, right? So one of the big complaints that was raised is this screws with internationalization. If you take away clear, delineated genders, how do I make pronouns? Here's my response to that. You can't. It's a rat hole. If you go for gendered pronouns, not only do you really get tripped up in English, it gets so much worse in other languages that depend really strongly on the relationship between nouns and gendered pronouns in ways that English doesn't conceptualize. You will get so messy so fast. You shouldn't be thinking in terms of being wedded to gender for the purposes of language. What you should be thinking of is how to avoid it, how to work around that. Because there's a plan here that comes with such a level of complexity that you're just going to get into a sinkhole. And we all know who Randall is, by the way, right? XKCD. So if it's going to screw you over like that, you want to think about avoiding. You want to think about rewording. You want to think about any possible scenario you can in which you're not depending on gender. You can collect it for other reasons, but if you're depending on it, eventually when you internationalize, it's going to hurt. If it's truly a requirement for your app, then the next way to cope with it is to start asking. And this was Randall's solution. He's examined this problem a bunch of times for English language projects, and if you've read any of his stuff, when he examines something, he does it in excruciating detail. What he really came to after quite a lot of research and thought is the bottom line is you have to ask straight up, what pronouns do you prefer? That really was the best that he could come up with. And this is the simple one. This is English. As complicated as this looks, it gets harder in other languages. So we're right back to the problem of how do we get this done? Yammer came up with a really great solution. For all their internationalization, they just crowdsourced it to the users. So you can ask individual users, what do you want? And then you can ask your international user bases, what is this likely to be? What should this be? And let users take it from there. You don't need to know all of the pronouns. You need to be able to give people a starting point. As developers, we have this vision. We have this belief that we know what a good code base should be and what it looks like. In the most sensible of ways, we often arrive at solutions that are factually truthy and yet far removed from real-life utility. So we go after these goals, right? We like nice, structured data, very predictable, linear, it lines up so nicely and it groups so well, relational, index to the nth degree. We think we're doing exhaustive, right? Because we have this belief that all of this stuff is going to lead us to nice, easy, useful analytics, and that we're going to be able to make good, data-driven decisions. We're not going to be doing all this like intuiting stuff. We're CS, we look at data. And what we actually do is just impose a lot of work on ourselves that's getting in our way and is getting in the way of the users. So we start adding all these validations to constrain the data in these ways that we want. And we start throwing exceptions because the stuff isn't really following constraints that we think they can. And we have all these conditionals and partials to deal with these different scenarios because human beings are so variable. So now we have to deal with each of these possibilities which are so limitless. And we're doing all this work, and it's premature optimization. There are simpler ways to deal with this and that don't have to deal with things like the infinite cultural variability, the infinite individual variability, and the fact that we're always changing anyway. Even if you could nail down today all the possibilities of what humans are like today, by tomorrow we're all screwed again. So we're making decisions on data that looks really good, but it's bogus. ERIS is the largest ongoing survey of America's religious identifications, and it just asks a really simple, open-ended question, right? What is your religion, if any? And that nets them about 100 unique answers. And if you're making a form based on this, you already know what's wrong there, right? 100 list items is just not going to work. There's no form element, in fact, that is going to make this easy on users to pick out something that fits for them. So ERIS found that they could compress that list down to 13 major categories, which if you're doing a drop-down or even checkboxes feels a little more manageable, right? We could use that on a form, although it still leaves an awful lot of edge cases, and we want to focus on the genuinely major groupings, right? We're not trying to find out who are the 2 in the whole user base who have some obscure religion. So we can just boil it down to this. Turns out that about 3/4 of Americans are Christian. I didn't know that either, by the way. So we're done right there. Every religion other than Christian is just clutter. That's all edge cases. And we're very comfortable leaving off edge cases, right? And then there's this sort of extra crummy data that we've got with it, which we'd probably start assigning nils to anyway for some of these categories. I mean, oh, maybe not other, but none, don't know, refuse. These feel a little nil-like. So we'll just fix that for them. Which focuses attention on the next problem, which is that 1 in 5 of these responses are not useful answers for us, certainly not from an advertiser's perspective, and certainly not for what we're probably trying to do with our own internal analytics. So the next thing is those nils, they gotta go. So what we're left with here is a really good, clear, well-normalized list that covers all the big stuff. So if you get reductive enough, for Americans, we discover that religion is in fact a binary. From a storage standpoint, isn't this so awesome? I mean, we can just reduce this whole thing down to a Boolean. Score! From 100 to Boolean, come on. But we don't do this stuff. We don't, because we know that although it covers the biggest categories, we recognize that this leaves people out. People just aren't edge cases. They're pushed back on being treated like one. So all this attempt to be reductive, it always has problems. But it's not just the reductive. Trying to scale upward also has problems. So we've always got this difficulty of trying to balance between approaches. And instinctually, we get kind of uncomfortable with this. Deliberately not structuring data for easy analysis. This gets me a little uptight, frankly. I really do. The foundational question we have to ask, though, is, again, what benefit will the user notice? It's not about servicing our discomfort. It's about alleviating theirs. And if necessary, we can find ways to strike a middle ground on that. A guided response, such as an auto-suggest. We can give a text field that allows them to be as expressive as they want, but still suggest a couple of options that we think are pretty good ones to start with. And then let them have their way as soon as they deviate from the expected values. So that's auto-suggest being that middle ground, but I really suggest that we be very minimalist about this. When you think there's a subset of values that you're most interested in, really just select the handful that you can to do minimal auto-suggest. This isn't placed to pre-populate with every field you've already got in the database, with every value you've got for that field. You want to just use those few values. You want to give structure to those who want to have it, while also giving that free form to incite that kind of meta-filter diaspora expressiveness and nuttiness that hopefully will get them excited about being in this site in the first place. And when you do that, even when you don't do that, like meta-filter has no structure at all and no suggest, and still 40% of the responses look pretty normalized to me. I mean, you can figure out what they were going for, right? So we don't have to treat this as either the choice between chaos and structure. There can be balanced ways of dealing with this stuff. It's true that data quantity is lower, freed of the option to provide data about ourselves. A lot of us don't provide it. On the other hand, now we're improving data quality because people aren't being coerced into giving a response, any response, including a false response, or giving a response just because they're annoyed and would like to mess with the person who did this to them. So it's fine to mix and match approaches here, and you can find the one that works best for you, for your users, for your business objectives. Like I said, there isn't a right answer that I'm just going to tell you, this is what you should do. Facebook makes relationship status completely optional, but then they get coercive if you do decide to give anything. You have to choose one of their values. Most users do provide a relationship status, 60% of them. So even in cases where people have free choice, a lot of them will opt in if you give them an opportunity. The bottom line is that we really want people to feel excited about what we're building, right? That's the whole point. We feel excitement in making it, and we want them to feel excitement too. We want them to feel that passion. We want them to be engaged, connected, staying in our community and building it up. We want analytics and investment and monetization to all be premised on good data that will help us build further. But the data that's been collected by coercive approaches, it has that risk of just being complete garbage, because of those people lying, because they feel forced to. So the conclusions that we draw from that bad data are just going to misdirect our decision-making about the next stages of development. We're not winning by forcing people into false choices. The restrictive options, that stuff at the bottom left, those don't actually have to be marked as required either. We have that bad habit. But the way we set up schema often embeds assumptions that we should and that we will. So we do. A field that's not allowed to be null is destined to be mandatory. A field that sets a very short length is asserting that any reasonable value is going to fit within it. This migration implies you're either going to be male or female. Transgender, not a reasonable value. If you're transgender, you'll wind up feeling coerced into a response that's inauthentic. And that UX experience started right here at the first thing we do. Boom, that's how we fix that. The foundation for an entirely different user experience. And the really cool move is that we win by doing less. Make this stuff flexible, at least up front. Optimize for storage later. Decide what's valid later. Right now, the best thing you can do is to start collecting values and have discoveries. So you have a discretionary field. Let people respond in whatever way they want and discover what they're telling you. As developers, we look on stuff like this as completely useless, redundant. Is it? It's true that null is true by default, right? But by making this explicit, it's a communication to the team and to your future self. It's a statement of intent. It's documenting a product decision that was conscious. So we wonder what a canonical set of relationship statuses would look like. 3 years ago, this was Facebook's, and they figured that list was pretty good. Arguably even progressive. I mean, hey, we got open relationship in there, and it's complicated. This sounds pretty modern, right? The users disagreed completely and very strongly. So under pressure, in just 2 years' time, they added many more. And when Google Plus launched, they largely adopted that list, noticeably leaving out separated and divorced. Notice that they also added something that Facebook hadn't, the option of choosing whether to say anything at all. Allowing users to identify their relationships with labels of greater personal significance. That's being driven by user experience. I can't wait for this one to happen. How did some statuses seem universal while others weren't? Naming a thing creates a scope. The assumed validity of a field's values are getting constrained as soon as the field is named. Marital status, for instance, might lead to a list like this one, in which you're assumed to either be unmarried, preparing to be married, currently married, formerly married. These are all the possible states, right? We got right back to that whole exhaustive thing. If you're talking about marital status. If you change your paradigm and think about relationship status, well, then the possible values change, don't they? And notice these aren't polar opposites. They're not completely inclusive. We still just have a different way of thinking. Now we're thinking in terms of, does one have a current relationship, or is their relationship status defined by absence of a relationship? But our real lives aren't actually organized as neatly as either of these. We go through life experiencing many, and sometimes new statuses don't replace the old ones. If you change the name entirely, you can shift the paradigm and the possibilities completely. I love what Flickr did here. They're not trying to be a dating site, but they recognized that users were trying to, and so they did something really different, Singleness Status. They really upended the whole notion that the important thing here is to arrange your profile around marriage. Naming fields, whatever it is, with great specificity up front will make analyses more powerful later. You know what it is you're collecting, and you're constantly reminding yourself every time you use that field what it's for. I like to be truthful. It's complicated is really deceiving for me. It's not complicated for her. She's separated. She's still married. What status is she supposed to choose? Single, separated? It's complicated, sure, but then it's leaving out things that are there and are true of her. All right, tell me if you can spot the fatal flaw in this one. Take a second, it'll come to you. Say it louder. Right, so what's the relational model here? This is supposed to be inherently one-to-many. All right, and of course, we're talking now database one-to-many, right, where the possible values can be 0, 1, or many. Now, this is the difficulty of mapping databases to people, but yeah, this is what happens when you just bow to the will of the people in a really unthinking fashion. They said they wanted an open relationship. Fine, we'll add it to the list. So this is Facebook failing at modeling relationships in a relational database. I love it. So here's the takeaways that I hope that you can have today. First one is that modeling the real world is really complex, and that's fine. The next is that early constraints in schemas are going to net us crappy, misleading data. We're assuming we know who users are, and that's surrendering our opportunity to discover who they actually are. Give ourselves a chance to find out. And the third is that, you know, that whole free-form text field, that's actually not going to kill us, as weird as it seems. Data quality improves when lies are merely optional, not required. We get data that's rich and specific. And then we get to unearth patterns that are undetectable when data is generic and prefabricated. We get to discover, we get to adapt. When we show trust in people, we also get to feel good about them placing trust in us. We get to have a conversation and that one-to-one relationship between them and us. And their response to all of that is that engagement, that passion, that loyalty that we want. And that's a foundation for great user experience. All right, so I happen to be a huge fan of Q&A, so I'm hoping that you have some cues.
Yeah, we've recently gone through a lot of, getting rid of gender fields, that sort of thing. But have the problem that we have other systems that we need to talk to that ask us for that information.
Yeah.
I think the current response we're giving is, oh, we'll give you garbage if we don't know.
Right.
But have you got any?
Well, yeah, I will go back to my earlier argument, which is that people, when they're required to give something, you can get what looks like incredibly clean data that has no relationship to the real world. So the advertisers or whoever you're monetizing this with, they feel really happy, but they could be getting better results. And it's worthwhile for us as developers. I mean, we use opinionated software, right? We're allowed to be opinionated developers and say, you're wrong. We can give you better data, and we refuse to give you crappy data. I know, not everyone's going to take that answer. I'm sorry, can you speak up a little louder?
In the real world, we've still got legacy systems.
Oh, yes. Right, right. So I'm curious how you are coping with that. Huh?
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, yes. Okay, so if you have legacy systems that are still dealing with that stuff, then you have to deal with those systems too. So what can you do about that? And I would actually like to hear from you how you're dealing with that.
If we can easily work out the gender, for example, they've said Mr., Mrs., then we'll give them that. Otherwise, I think we go with whatever, just the default.
So one thing that you can do, and it depends on whether we're... Oh, sorry. So one of the things they do is essentially try to extract out values that seem reasonable, what the advertiser is. I take it an advertiser. Whatever the other party is expecting to see, and try to pull out as much of that as possible. One thing you can do is simply be more clear with users about why you're asking for this data. If you have to give them pre-selected fields and you have to make it required, just saying why, rather than giving them the opportunity to assume that you're just nosy or that you're being Facebook and Google scooping up all the data that exists in the world, then they often are much more willing to share that in a form that is easier for you. So I think a lot of this has to do with communication. Communicate with the users more candidly, and communicate with the consumers of our data as well more candidly about, we think that what you want is the wrong thing to do. You're not going to be happy with the result of what you're asking for. Yeah.
When you're doing your data analysis on this data you collect, how have you seen what your analysis change now that you're doing things more freeform versus more restricted values?
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of, oh, okay. So if you start taking freeform data, what can you do to analyze it then? How does that change analysis? In part, you get into interesting stuff like machine learning. I mean, you can really start playing with this stuff. This is an opportunity to use things like NoSQL for storage. You know, you can do document-based storage instead of being quite so wedded to relationals. It's an opportunity to, I think, go some technology spelunking is what I would describe it as. Learn some new things and discover how data is changing over time. You're not necessarily having to look at all those individual values, but for instance, are you detecting a few trends? I would be particularly interested when you're starting out with something like gender or age or marital status to leave it open enough that you get to find out how people describe themselves. It may not even be necessarily that we're looking to constrain fields, but is there a certain way that they characterize themselves? If it's even something like, say, age, do they have a natural way of lumping themselves together that you can use in the future? So we're not always looking for something that's a breakdown in really strict sort of graphical terms. Sometimes it's about, what are some interesting clusters that we wouldn't have known existed? Ooh, somehow that inspired things. Hi.
Yeah, I was interested you mentioned age. Do you think is there a reasonable limit to how expressive users should be allowed to be? And how does that interact with legal requirements on data gathering?
Can you give me an example? Oh, did everyone get to hear that one? Okay. Can you shout it louder?
Sure. You mentioned age.
Mm-hmm.
What if someone says they're, say, over a legal limit, but they're not?
What would they be over a legal limit for?
Say if you have a site that might be about alcohol or dating, and you have to be over a certain age to legally interact with that.
Okay. Okay.
How do you interact with legal requirements?
Yeah.
As opposed to user expression of themselves.
Yeah, it depends.
I express myself as 30. I'm actually 15, but.
Yeah, I started lying about my age for reasons that have nothing to do with the usual cultural stereotypes. Yeah, my birthday is always on January 1st, by the way. Be sure to get me a gift. Yeah, in the US, there is a law like this. Certain websites cannot collect personally identifiable information about youth under 13. The law is pretty specific about what constitutes private identifiable information about youth, so it doesn't mean that every site has to exclude 13-year-olds, but it becomes a really sort of common checkbox of every user, please give us your birth date so we can verify that you're over 13 so we can feel comfortable that no one's going to sue us later. So we do get that kind of stuff, and you have to make some choices. I mean, if you're dealing with a legal constraint, then I really can't say this is your solution. Your solution is going to have to be to talk to your lawyer. But I think one of the things you can do is start thinking about what is the information you really need. In that context, you do not need to know their birth date. The information you genuinely need is, are you over X age? And as long as the lawyer says that that is sufficient documentation, why are we asking nosy questions? I saw, yeah.
Are you, with regards to freeform data, are you assuming that all of your users will be providing that data in the same spoken language?
Ah, good question.
In a single spoken language for that user?
Okay, so an interesting assumption here is essentially if people are providing freeform data, can we make the assumption that they're providing it all in the same language, or at least all in the same, I guess, written language? In this case, I think that's totally up to your app. I mean, it may well be the case. In fact, I would say it has to be the case that you're going to get some things in languages you didn't anticipate and in character sets you didn't anticipate, and that should be the point. I mean, that's one of those interesting trends to discover, isn't it? I mean, you might discover that, hey, we need to be, branching out to Singapore immediately. We did not know that. Yeah, that is certainly an issue. I have to say that one of the things that I do, particularly in researching this stuff, is I hack forums all the time to see just how strong their validation is. That gender is the easy one to check because they all think that, you know, male and female are the only possible options. So it's really easy to just open up the developer tools and start seeing what happens if you give a value that supposedly isn't possible. Which is how you get stuff like, by the way, your gender is invalid, that nice little example from Spotify. Just so you know, Spotify. They changed it like a day after someone tweeted that one, so it helps to take note. Okay, so did that fully answer your question, though? The assumption is don't make the assumption, yeah. But that's true of anything we're putting in the text field. That's sort of the point of having a text field is let's stop making assumptions and see what happens. Yeah, great shirt there.
Yeah, there's an enjoyable classic book on this topic called Data and Reality by William Kent. It's from the 1970s, but so it's not talking about identity particularly, but just a general mapping of how difficult it is to model a real world, essentially. Oh,
okay. Thank you for that. And could you tweet me that title? I would love to know about that, or something. cczona@gmail.com. Thank you very much. I'll check into that. You've been raising your hand for a while back there in gray.
You spoke a lot about identity, but do you think that, and obviously that applies to gender and sexualities, but do you also consider that it applies to your name? Because quite often you see first name, last name. And I think Patrick McKenzie had a great blog post about assumptions programmers make about names.
Yes.
That people even have a name, which probably was surprising for me, but...
I love that one. There's also some imitators. So what he's talking about is a post called, I believe it's 40 Myths Programmers Believe About Names. And that was just the first 40 that he provided, and I think users provided easily 100 more myths. Mostly out of their own outrage about how their name had been abused. Apparently anyone with an apostrophe in their name has a really hard life. I feel so sorry for them. Yeah, I actually had to leave this out because this is a great topic that is part of this, and I'm really glad you raised it. So throughout Spanish-speaking countries, Portuguese, Latin America, it is standard to have a surname for your child that is essentially bringing together both parents' names. And so throughout the Latin American world, it's really common, first of all, that your last name definitely doesn't match either of your parents' last name because they're each time being instructed from your own parents. But also that you get really long names. The idea that there's this sort of first, middle, last gets thrown into chaos if you've got users from the Spanish-speaking world or the Portuguese-speaking world. And you should care because that is one of the top 2, I believe it is. It might be the 2nd or 3rd most spoken native language in the world. So hopefully you are interested in having fields long enough to accommodate their real name. Yeah, that example I also showed of trying to validate first name, one or more characters. I actually met a number of people who kept complaining, yeah, I'm so glad you talk about this because I constantly get turned away by fields that think my 2-letter name isn't enough. So I actually found a website which is cited in the resources here. There's like 195 really common around the world 2-letter first names. And by first name, I really should say given name, right? Because that's part of the question you're asking is that we have this model that comes up pretty regularly of that there's a first name, possibly a middle, and there's a last name. And, you know, that is not at all a given. And then we try to add on some stuff like we assume that there's a title, and if so, that it has like one of maybe 4 or 5 categories, you know, Mr., Ms., Mrs., Doctor, and then that's it. Which A is not true, and sometimes these things overlap.
I was going to ask a similar question, but I can almost extend that a little bit further. It's really a question about how do you use the name data that you've then collected. So very often, like I think it was Flickr even goes like hola Dan or hello Dan or this is my first name lots of different ways.
Yeah.
How do I know how to address somebody if I don't know what their first name is or last name?
Yeah, so this is where we're looking at the difference between, say, a legal name and term of address. Because that person, regardless of whether they have whatever's on their documentation, essentially, people probably talk to them. So they have some sort of name. Sometimes it's essentially their username is their name, or that they have some sort of pseudonymous, okay, I can't pronounce that, name. But there's something that they're conventionally known by, or within that particular community want to be known by, and that might even be a username. The point is that we shouldn't care what their actual username is. We should care that we're addressing them by the name they want to be addressed by within that context.
What do you want us to call them?
Yeah, exactly. Or just name without putting any constraints on it, like saying first name or last name. I mean, that's one of the great ways to deal, for instance, with the problems of those Spanish names, is don't try to break it out. Just say, what's your name?
I think we need to break
Yeah, okay.